For thousands of years, people looked at the Arabian desert and saw emptiness, endless sand, scorching heat, almost no water, a place where life could barely survive. But beneath that seemingly lifeless landscape, archaeologists are finding something that changes the story completely. Ancient lakes, lost rivers, massive stone monuments, burial roads stretching across the desert, and even fortified settlements that once sheltered entire communities. The most surprising part isn't that these things existed, it's that we didn't know they were there. For generations, Arabia was often described as a harsh crossroads between the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. People imagined travelers crossing it, merchants passing through it, and nomadic groups moving from one water source to another. But that picture is beginning to collapse. Because the Arabian Peninsula wasn't always a desert. In the distant past, the landscape could look dramatically different. When rainfall increased, parts of Arabia transformed into grasslands filled with lakes, rivers, animals, and vegetation. The places we now associate with some of the harshest conditions on Earth could temporarily become surprisingly habitable. And this wasn't a single event. Evidence from caves and geological deposits suggests that Arabia experienced repeated cycles of becoming wetter and greener before eventually drying again. Imagine standing in the middle of the desert today. There is sand in every direction. Now imagine that same landscape thousands of years ago, covered with grass, dotted with lakes, and crossed by people following herds of animals. Suddenly, the desert doesn't look empty anymore. It looks like a landscape that has forgotten its past, and some of the strongest clues come from the animals that once lived there. Archaeologists have discovered ancient remains of creatures that would seem completely out of place in today's Arabia, including large mammals and water-dependent animals. Stone tools found alongside animal remains provide another remarkable clue. Humans weren't simply passing through a dead landscape. They were hunting, gathering, and surviving there during periods when water and food were available. And this story goes back far beyond the rise of the first great cities. Evidence suggests that earlier human populations occupied parts of Arabia hundreds of thousands of years ago. Later, modern humans also entered the region during wetter periods. Some groups may have remained for generations, others disappeared. And eventually, new groups arrived when the environment became favorable again. This reveals something important about human history. People didn't simply conquer landscapes. They adapted to them. When the rains returned, communities expanded into the grasslands. When the water disappeared, they changed their way of life. And perhaps that constant environmental change explains why Arabia developed such a fascinating archaeological record. Because some of its most mysterious monuments weren't built by enormous empires. They were built by communities that we barely knew existed. One of the most extraordinary examples is a type of structure known as a mustatil. From above, these ancient stone structures can look almost like enormous rectangles drawn across the desert. Some are relatively small. Others stretch hundreds of meters. Thousands have been identified across parts of northern Saudi Arabia. And here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Many of these monuments are thousands of years old, dating back to a period long before the famous pyramids of Egypt. Think about that for a moment. When we picture the world's earliest monumental architecture, we often imagine famous civilizations with enormous populations, centralized governments, and powerful rulers. But in Arabia, people were already organizing labor to construct enormous stone monuments while living in a very different kind of society. What were these structures for? They don't appear to have been ordinary houses. They weren't simply defensive walls. Instead, evidence from some sites points toward ritual activity. Researchers have found animal horns, skull fragments, and other remains placed around special stone features. That suggests these locations may have played an important ceremonial role. Perhaps communities gathered there during important seasons. Perhaps rituals were connected to animals, fertility, rainfall, or beliefs about supernatural forces. We cannot know every detail, but one thing is becoming increasingly clear. These were not meaningless piles of stones. They were deliberate monuments created by people who had reasons for building them. And that raises another question. If people were traveling to these places for ceremonies, how connected were the communities living across Arabia? The answer may be hidden in another extraordinary feature of the landscape: ancient pathways. Across parts of northwestern Arabia, archaeologists have identified long corridors lined with tombs. Some of these routes connected water sources, pastures, settlements, and burial places. Instead of imagining isolated groups wandering randomly across an enormous desert, we can now begin to picture something much more organized. People knew where water was. They knew where grazing land could be found. They knew where their ancestors were buried. And they knew the routes connecting one important location to another. In other words, Arabia had networks, not necessarily roads in the modern sense, not necessarily an empire controlled from one central capital, but networks of people, animals, resources, traditions, and memories. And then something even more surprising happened. Some communities began building permanent settlements. One of the most fascinating examples lies at the oasis of Khaybar. Archaeologists have identified evidence of an ancient fortified settlement there, complete with houses, streets, burial areas, and defensive structures. For a landscape traditionally imagined as dominated by temporary camps, this is a major discovery. Because a settlement with walls is telling us something. People weren't simply visiting the oasis. They were investing in it. They were building homes, organizing space, protecting resources, and creating places that could survive beyond the lifetime of a single family. Yet these settlements don't necessarily resemble the enormous cities of Mesopotamia. And perhaps that's exactly why they were misunderstood. For a long time, civilization has often been measured by size. Bigger cities, bigger monuments, bigger armies, bigger palaces. But what if that isn't the only way a civilization can succeed? What if the people of ancient Arabia developed a system perfectly adapted to their unpredictable environment? Think about the challenge they faced. A settlement could flourish when water was available. But if rainfall patterns changed and the surrounding land became dry, remaining permanently tied to one enormous city could become dangerous. A smaller fortified settlement connected to surrounding pastoral communities could offer something different: stability when conditions were good, flexibility when conditions changed. And that may have been the real genius of these societies. They weren't necessarily trying to copy Egypt or Mesopotamia. They were solving their own problems. And this is where the discovery becomes much bigger than archaeology. Because the mystery isn't simply who built these structures. The deeper mystery is why we overlooked them for so long. The answer may be hiding in the very thing that preserved the mystery: the desert itself. Sand can destroy evidence, but it can also bury it. Wind can erase footprints. Shifting dunes can cover walls, roads, houses, and entire settlements. And when archaeologists look across a vast desert and see almost nothing on the surface, that doesn't necessarily mean nothing is underneath. It may simply mean the evidence is hidden. Modern technology is beginning to change that. Aerial surveys, satellite imagery, remote sensing, geological studies, and targeted excavations are revealing patterns that would be almost impossible to recognize from the ground. Structures that seem insignificant when viewed individually can become astonishing when mapped across an entire region. And suddenly, what looked like scattered stones becomes a network. What looked like an isolated tomb becomes part of a route. What looked like an empty desert becomes the remains of a vanished world. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. History is not only the story of what survived, it's also the story of what disappeared. The civilizations we know best are often the civilizations that left behind the strongest visible monuments. Stone cities, written records, royal tombs, massive temples, but countless communities left behind far more fragile traces. Their settlements were abandoned, their paths were buried, their buildings collapsed, their traditions disappeared, and eventually, the landscape itself concealed the evidence. For centuries, we looked at Arabia and saw a blank space. Now we're beginning to realize it wasn't blank. It was simply hidden. And here's the question that should stay with you after this video. If thousands of ancient monuments, forgotten settlements, and vanished landscapes can remain hidden beneath one of the world's most familiar deserts, how many other chapters of human history are still waiting beneath places we assume we already understand? The next discovery may not rewrite one small part of history. It may force us to reconsider who we thought the ancient world belonged to in the first place. Because sometimes the greatest archaeological mystery isn't finding something nobody has ever seen. It's realizing that something was there all along. If this story changed the way you see the Arabian desert, leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy uncovering the hidden chapters of human history, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There are still countless mysteries buried beneath the world's most familiar landscapes, and we may only be beginning to uncover them.